Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another scary story. Your place where we uncover the darkest mysteries in a calming and reflective way. For the next hour, I want you to put on your earphones, put your phone face down, and close your eyes. Relax, and let this story take you to a world full of chills and mystery. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, leave a comment sharing where in the world you're listening from. Now get comfortable and relax. I was raised in Blackwood Creek, a place where people kept their heads down and their beliefs close. We were taught that God watches over us, that evil existed in the world, and that curiosity, real curiosity, was dangerous. There were things we weren't meant to understand, and asking the wrong questions could lead to trouble. My parents never had to say it out loud, but I understood. Some doors, once opened, never really closed. Daniel and I were 17 that summer, restless, and reckless in the way only small-town kids could be. We weren't troublemakers, not really, but we wanted something more than dusty roads and Wednesday night church services. When my grandmother passed, her old farmhouse became our escape. My family had been clearing it out for weeks, and one afternoon, while sorting through boxes in the attic, we found the trunk. It was heavy, older than anything else up there, its iron latch rusted shut. It took both of us to pry it open, dust swirling in the dim light from the attic window. Inside were faded letters, yellowed photographs, and buried beneath them, something we never should have touched. A spirit board. It wasn't like the ones you see in stores. The wood was thick and dark, the letters carved instead of painted. The planchette was smooth and heavy, its edges worn from use. It felt old, wrong somehow. Daniel picked it up immediately. "Dude, this is legit," he said, turning it over in his hands. I hesitated. I could already hear my mother's voice in the back of my mind. "You don't mess with things like that." "We should try it," Daniel said, grinning. I shook my head. "I don't know, man." He gave me a look. "What, you scared?" That was all it took. That night, after my parents went to bed, we sat, cross-legged on my bedroom floor, a single candle flickering between us. At first we laughed, nudging the planchette around the board, spelling out nonsense. But then Daniel got serious. "If there's anyone here, tell us your name." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the planchette moved. Slow. Deliberate. A chill ran up my spine. I glanced at Daniel, but he wasn't smiling anymore. I swallowed hard. "Mine?" The candle flickered violently. The air in the room felt heavy. Daniel's voice was quieter now. "What happened there?" The planchette slid again. DEATH. The candle went out. And then from somewhere upstairs we heard something move. Neither of us spoke. The room was silent except for our breathing, but we had both heard it. The sound of something shifting above us. Daniel exhaled, shaking his head. That was the attic. I forced a laugh, but it sounded weak. Probably just the house settling. But I didn't believe it. The air felt wrong, charged like the moment before a thunderstorm. My skin prickled, and I suddenly had the overwhelming sense that we were not alone. Daniel cleared his throat. "Ask it something else." I didn't want to, but my hand was already moving. WHO. The planchette jerked suddenly, dragging our hands with it. THEM. The hairs on my arms stood up. The attic creaked again, the sound slow and deliberate. Then from the hallway outside my room there was a knock. 3 sharp, precise taps. My breath caught in my throat. Daniel stared at me, his face pale. "Dude, your door is locked." I didn't answer. I couldn't. The knocking came again, louder this time, and then from the attic above us, a sound that made my stomach drop. A long, slow, dragging noise. Like something heavy was being pulled across the floor. We slammed the board shut, tossing it back into the trunk like it might burn us. The second the lid closed, the dragging sound stopped. For a long moment we just sat there, listening. Nothing. Just the hum of the old house around us. Then we heard the scratching. It was faint at first, barely noticeable, but it grew louder, closer. It was coming from my window. Daniel was already shaking his head. Nope, no way. My stomach twisted. My room was on the second floor. There was nothing outside that window. The scratching stopped, and then, bang. Something slammed against the glass. We ran. We bolted downstairs past the cellar door, which suddenly burst open as we passed, and straight into the living room. We sat there, backs against the couch, too scared to move. That night, we didn't sleep. At 3:13 a.m., Daniel's bedroom door slammed shut on its own. When we finally got the courage to open it, his room was wrecked. Furniture overturned, drawers pulled from their cabinets, and deep, jagged scratches covering the wooden floor. Scratches that hadn't been there before. Scratches that formed symbols. After that night, things changed. At first, it was small. A whisper when I was home alone. A shadow in my peripheral vision. My bed would shake, not violently, but enough to wake me. Then it got worse. Some nights, I'd wake up paralyzed, unable to move, unable to scream, and always at the foot of my bed it would be there, a shadow tall and thin, its edges shifting like smoke. It never spoke, never moved, just watched. The whispers grew louder. They started saying my name. One night, as I was brushing my teeth, I looked up at the mirror and saw something standing behind me. I turned around. There was nothing there. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed help. My family didn't believe in ghosts, but there was one man in town who did, an elder. Someone the church didn't talk about, but people went to when things went wrong. I told him everything. He listened, then nodded. You invited something in. I felt sick. How do I get rid of it? We cleansed the house. That night, he walked through the farmhouse whispering prayers in a language I didn't understand. He left markings above the doors, symbols drawn in ash. In my room, he pressed something cold into my hand, a rusted nail. Keep this with you when you sleep, he said. Do not let it go. That night, for the first time in weeks, I slept without nightmares. The shadows didn't move. The whispers didn't come. But I never forgot. Even now, years later, I don't go near old boards. I don't ask questions about things best left alone, because I know some doors once opened can never truly be closed. I have never liked the dark. Even now, as an adult, I keep a small lamp on at night. I tell myself it's just a habit. Nothing unusual, nothing irrational. But the truth is, I have never truly forgotten what happened when I was a child. Some memories fade. Others stay with you, burned into the fabric of your mind. And then there are the ones that change you. The ones that twist something inside you, make you see the world differently. This is one of those memories. I was only 4 years old when it happened. We lived in an old house near Willow Creek, the kind of place that creaked and sighed when the wind passed through. My parents never noticed the sounds, but I did. Lying in my crib, I would hear them at night. The distant whisper of the creek, the rustling of the willow trees just outside my window. And then there were the whispers. Not the trees, not the wind. Something else. Something inside the room. The night it happened, I woke up suddenly. At first, I wasn't sure why. The room was quiet except for the gentle swaying of the willows outside. Moonlight filtered through the curtains, casting long shadows across the nursery walls. Then I felt it. A pressure in the air. A presence. My breath caught in my throat. I turned my head slowly, too slowly, and saw it. A figure. Standing at the foot of my crib. It was tall and thin, its body barely solid, as if it were made of mist. Its skin, if it could even be called that, was a sickly, washed-out gray, stretched too tightly over its bones. And its eyes. I still dream about those eyes. Not hollow, not empty, but filled with something hungry. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure leaned forward. Its mouth moved, but the sounds it made weren't words, at least, not words I understood. The whispering filled the air, curling around me like a fog, pressing into my ears, sinking into my skin. I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. It was stealing something from me, my breath, my voice, something deeper. And then, without thinking, I did the only thing I could. I cried out. Not for my mother, not for my father, for my grandmother. The one who always whispered to me before bed, who told me stories about spirits that watched over children. The moment her name left my lips, the air cracked. The whispering stopped. The figure flinched, its form flickering, its eyes widening in what I can only describe as fear. And then, it recoiled. Not like a person stepping back, but like a shadow, being yanked away, sucked into the darkness of the nursery's corner. Gone. I gasped, air rushing back into my lungs. The silence was deafening. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, curled into a ball, too afraid to move, too afraid to blink. By morning, I convinced myself it had been a dream, until I saw the marks on the crib, faint but deep, claw-like, indentations on the wood where the figure had stood. That was the day I stopped sleeping in the dark, and the day I learned that some whispers aren't meant to be heard. But what I didn't know then was that it wasn't over, not even close. Growing up, I tried to forget. But fear isn't something you can just outgrow. It settles in your bones, shapes the way you see the world. It lingers, waiting for the right moment to remind you that it's still there. And in my case, it never really left. The first problem started with the dark. Even as a child, I could never sleep in complete darkness. I needed light, just enough to keep the shadows at bay. I told myself it was just a childhood fear, something harmless. But my parents didn't see it that way. My father thought I was being dramatic. He said I was too old for nightlights, that I needed to toughen up. My mother was softer, but she didn't understand. "It was just a bad dream, sweetheart," she would say, brushing my hair back. "You're safe now." But I wasn't, because I still heard the whispers. They were faint, barely noticeable, soft hisses that would drift through the room late at night, carried on the wind. Or at least, that's what I told myself. The second problem was the trees. The willows outside my window never bothered anyone else. But I knew better. At night, they moved differently. Not with the wind, not naturally, but with intent. The branches would scrape against the glass, rhythmic, deliberate, like fingertips tapping. I stopped looking out my window at night. I didn't want to know what was waiting just beyond the glass. The fear followed me into adulthood. I learned to function, to pretend I was fine, but the feeling never faded. I never let my room go completely dark. I never lived near willow trees, and I never ignored a whisper, because I knew, deep down, it was still watching, waiting, for me to let my guard down. I told myself I had grown out of it. The fear, the paranoia, it was childish, something I should have let go of a long time ago. And for a while, I convinced myself I had. I went to college, moved to the city, built a life away from Willow Creek and the nursery, where it all began. But fear isn't something you leave behind. It follows you, curling around the edges of your life, waiting for the right moment to remind you it's still there. It took years, but eventually, it found me again. It started with the insomnia. I had always been a light sleeper, but this was different. No matter how exhausted I was, the moment I closed my eyes, something shifted in the room. The air felt heavier, the silence deeper. I would lie there, staring at the ceiling, feeling like something was just beyond my line of sight. I told myself it was stress. I had been working late nights at the museum, cataloging artifacts, some of them older than recorded history. That kind of work does things to your mind, makes you think about time differently, about the things that came before us. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just exhaustion, because I started hearing the whispers again. Faint at first, just a soft hissing at the edge of my hearing, sometimes in the walls, sometimes in the hallway, sometimes right next to my bed. Then the sleep paralysis came back. The first time it happened, I woke to find myself frozen, my body pinned to the mattress. I couldn't move, couldn't even twitch my fingers. The only thing I could do was listen. At first there was silence. Then the whispering began. I don't know how to describe it. It wasn't a language I recognized, but I understood it all the same. It was hungry, insidious, curling around my mind like a slow-moving fog. And then I felt it. The pressure. Not just in the air, on my chest. Like something was pressing down on me, stealing my breath. It lasted seconds, maybe minutes, before my body jerked awake. I sat up, gasping for air, my hands shaking. The room was still, empty, but I knew, without a doubt, that I hadn't been alone. After that, everything started to unravel. My coworkers noticed first. I came in exhausted, dark circles under my eyes, jumpy at the smallest noises. One afternoon, I knocked over an entire stack of files when someone called my name too suddenly. "You look like hell," my friend Leah said, frowning as she handed me a coffee. "You okay?" "Yeah," I lied, forcing a weak smile. I wasn't okay at all. The paranoia bled into my waking life. I started noticing shadows. That didn't belong. Shapes at the edge of my vision that disappeared when I turned my head. At work, I swore I saw someone standing behind me in the museum's reflection cases. Someone too tall, too thin, with a shape that didn't quite belong to a person. At home, I began avoiding mirrors, because every now and then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something watching. I stopped sleeping, and that's when the real problem started. I started making mistakes. At work, I misplaced documents, misfiled artifacts. Small things at first, then bigger. One night, while working late, I was reviewing an exhibit proposal when I noticed something strange. An old ledger from the Willow Creek estate, my childhood home, had somehow ended up on my desk. I stared at it, my heart hammering. I hadn't pulled this file. I hadn't even known it was in our archives. But there it was. I hesitated, then slowly flipped it open. The handwriting was old, looping, but I could make out the words. January 13th, 1902. Infant found unresponsive in nursery. Third occurrence this season. My stomach dropped. Third occurrence. This season. I turned the page, my hands shaking. More names, more infants. All from my childhood home. All found the same way, as if something had stolen their breath. A low sound built in my ears, distant at first, then growing. A hiss. A whisper. I shoved the book away and bolted from the office, leaving my papers scattered across the desk. I didn't look back. That night, I barricaded my bedroom door. It didn't help. At 3:13 a.m., I woke to the sensation of breath on my neck. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. The whispering was inside my room now, crawling along the walls, shifting through the air, and then a hand, cold, bony, pressing against my arm. I squeezed my eyes shut, my heart slamming against my ribs. A voice, low, insidious, almost mocking, hissed something in my ear. Not in English, not in any language I knew, but I understood it all the same. I never left. The moment my body unlocked, I threw myself out of bed and flipped on every light. My chest heaved, sweat dripping down my spine. The room was empty, but I could still feel it, watching, waiting, for me to let my guard down again. I had two choices, run or face it, and I was so tired of running. The next morning I drove back to Willow Creek. The house was still there, abandoned now, overgrown with ivy. The willows still stood outside, their branches moving without wind. I walked inside, heart pounding, my breath shallow. The nursery door was open. The crib was still there. And carved into the wooden frame, deep enough to split the wood, was my name. I don't remember screaming. I don't remember running. I just remember the shadows moving, the air tightening, the whispering rising, and the willows bending toward the window, like something inside was calling them closer. I left Willow Creek that night. I don't know if it's over. I don't know if it ever will be, because some things don't haunt houses. They haunt people. And wherever I go, I know it is still watching. I have spent my life chasing history, unearthing stories lost to time, piecing together the fragmented whispers of the past. I used to believe that history was simply a collection of facts, dates, names, events. But now I know better. Some histories are not meant to be uncovered. Some stories do not wish to be told. In the winter of 1888, I left the city behind for a research project in the remote Ardennes forest, near the small village of Rochereau. My studies had led me to a collection of obscure folk tales detailing strange rituals, hauntings, and warnings about an ancient presence that lurked in the depths of the forest. The people of Rochereau were reluctant to speak of it, their eyes shadowed with something that looked like fear. But I was not afraid, not then. I rented a small stone cottage on the edge of the silent grove, a dense expanse of twisted trees that had stood for centuries untouched and undisturbed. The villagers warned me not to stay too close to the grove, speaking in hushed tones about restless spirits and the thing that wandered the woods at night. Superstitions, I had told myself, just old stories meant to frighten children. I had no reason to doubt them until the night terrors began. The first episode came after a long evening of research. I had spent the day poring over ancient texts, reading accounts of strange disappearances and whispered legends of a shadow that followed those who ventured too close to the grove. Exhausted, I collapsed onto my bed, my candle flickering weakly in the cold air. Sometime in the night I woke, or rather, I thought I woke. My body was frozen. I couldn't move, couldn't even blink. The fire had burned low, casting long, skeletal shadows across the walls. Then I heard it. The sound of rustling leaves. At first I thought it was the wind, but it grew louder, closer, until it was inside the room. The air became thick, suffocating, charged with something unseen. And then the chanting began. Low, guttural, spoken in a language I did not recognize. The syllables twisted in my ears, layered upon one another, filling the room with an unnatural hum that made my skin crawl. I tried to scream, to move, anything, but I was trapped in my own body. Then from the corner of the room it emerged, a figure, tall and impossibly thin, its form shifting like smoke. It had no face, only darkness where features should have been. Yet I felt its gaze heavy and filled with something terrible. It did not move. It only watched. And then, in an instant, it was gone. The moment my body was released, I sat up gasping, my breath fogging in the freezing air. The room was silent again. Only the dying embers of the fire remained. It was just a nightmare, I told myself, a trick of the mind. But deep down, I knew the truth. Something had been in that room with me, and it was not finished. The night terrors did not stop. They came every night, dragging me into the same terrifying paralysis, the same suffocating fear. The rustling always came first, then the chanting, and then it would appear, standing at the edge of my bed, watching. The days became unbearable. I could no longer focus on my research. I was exhausted, plagued by headaches, my hands trembling as I tried to hold my pen steady. The cottage, once a place of quiet solitude, had become a prison. And then I started, seeing it even when I was awake. At first it was just a flicker, a shadow in the corner of my vision disappearing the moment I turned my head. Then it grew bolder. I would be reading at my desk and see its reflection in the window, standing behind me. And worst of all, I felt it. At night, as I lay awake, I could sense something watching me from the dark corners of the room. The air would turn cold, and the feeling of unseen eyes would press down on me until my breath came in shallow gasps. I could not stay in that cottage much longer, but I was a historian, and I needed answers. Desperate for an explanation, I turned to the village's oldest texts, searching for anything that could explain what was happening to me. That's when I found it. A passage buried in a crumbling manuscript, detailing the shadow of the silent grove, an ancient presence said to haunt those who disturbed its land. The accounts described exactly what I had been experiencing: the rustling, the chanting, the paralysis, and there was only one way to stop it. The text spoke of protective rituals, of calling upon ancestral spirits to ward off the shadow. I had never placed much faith in such things, but I was running out of options. That night, as the wind howled outside the cottage, I gathered what I needed. I traced the ancient symbols in chalk along the doorways, burned herbs in a small dish, and whispered the names of those who had come before me. As I finished, the air in the room shifted. It felt lighter, almost peaceful. For the first time in months, I slept without fear. But in the morning, something was left behind. A single blackened handprint on the wall. A warning, or a promise. The rituals helped. The presence no longer appeared at my bedside. The paralysis ceased. But I was never truly alone. The feeling of being watched remained, a constant weight pressing down on my shoulders. When I walked through the forest, I could feel it, an unseen force lingering at the edges of my vision just beyond the trees. The village elders refused to speak of it. When I asked them about the texts, they only shook their heads and muttered prayers under their breath. "You were lucky," one old woman finally whispered. "Most who see it do not survive." I left Rocheho soon after, but the shadow followed. Even now, years later, I feel it. Some nights I wake with the heavy sensation of unseen eyes watching from the darkness. The rustling leaves still echo in my ears. I never returned to the Ardennes. I never finished my research. Some histories, I have learned, are not meant to be studied, because they are not stories, they are warnings, and I fear that the shadow is waiting for me to forget, waiting for me to let my guard down. I had always been drawn to places with history. There was something about old buildings, the way they held the weight of time, the imprint of the lives that had passed through them. So when I found the loft in the restored Ironwood Asylum, I didn't hesitate. The listing described it as a Victorian-era masterpiece turned modern living space. High ceilings, original hardwood floors, exposed brick walls. Everything I had ever wanted in an apartment. The history didn't bother me, not at first. I told myself that ghosts were just stories, that the past couldn't reach out from the grave and touch the present. I had always been a skeptic, the kind of person who laughed at ghost hunting shows and rolled my eyes at people who claimed their houses were haunted. But Ironwood changed that. It made me believe. The building sat on a hill overlooking Hollow Creek, the small Appalachian town where I had taken a job as an archivist for the local historical society. The asylum had been closed for decades, its doors locked after a series of scandals involving patient mistreatment and experimental treatments gone wrong. For years, the structure had been abandoned, decaying, swallowed by time. Then a developer had stepped in, transforming the rotting facility into upscale apartments. The exterior still carried the weight of its past: Gothic arches, iron railings, and looming windows that seemed to stare down like hollow eyes. But inside, everything was sleek and modern. The walls had been repainted, the floors polished, the old patient rooms turned into open-concept living spaces. The moment I stepped inside, though, I felt it. A weight. Not physical, but something unseen pressing against my skin, against my bones. The air was colder than it should have been, carrying a faint scent that I couldn't place. Something sharp, clinical, antiseptic. I ignored it. I signed the lease. And by nightfall, I had moved in. The first few days passed without incident. I unpacked, arranged my bookshelves, settled into my new routine. The building was quiet, almost unnervingly, so most of the other tenants worked long hours and the thick walls absorbed sound, leaving my loft eerily silent at night. It wasn't until the third night that I saw her. I had been sitting on the couch, my laptop balanced on my legs, when I felt it. A shift in the room. The air turned frigid, enough to make me shiver. I glanced up, and she was there. A woman, standing just outside my bedroom door. Her gown was white, tattered at the edges, the fabric hanging off her frame like it was weighed down by water. Her hair was long, stringy, her face obscured, as if I were looking at her through fogged glass. She didn't move, didn't blink. She just watched. My breath stalled in my throat. I wanted to scream, to move, to do something, but my body refused to respond. Then, in the blink of an eye, she was gone. The room warmed instantly, the pressure in the air lifting. I exhaled shakily, my body trembling as I pushed myself off the couch. I flicked on every light in the apartment, checking every room, every closet, even though I knew no one was there. It had been real. I had seen her, and I had no idea what she wanted. The dreams started after that. Vivid, horrible dreams. I dreamt of iron tables, of leather restraints biting into wrists, of muffled screams that never quite reached the air. The images were sharp, too real, as if I were seeing something that had actually happened, as if I were remembering. I woke, up every night drenched in sweat, my heart pounding against my ribs. The scent of antiseptic clung to my nostrils, sharp and pungent. And always, when I sat up in bed, struggling to slow my breathing, the room would be colder than before. I stopped sleeping after that. I tried to ignore it, to rationalize what I had seen. Maybe I had been overtired. Maybe the history of the building was getting into my head. But deep down, I knew the truth. Ironwood hadn't forgotten its past, and something inside its walls had noticed me. Something that wasn't finished yet. I became obsessed. I told myself I was just doing research for work, that my sudden interest in Ironwood's past was academic. But I knew better. I wasn't studying history anymore. I was trying to understand what was haunting me. The records weren't easy to find. The asylum's history had been buried, lost in stacks of misfiled documents, buried in archives that no one had touched in years. But I was an archivist, and I was relentless. I spent hours combing through old newspapers, patient logs, letters from doctors to grieving families. And the more I read, the more horrified I became. Ironwood hadn't just been an asylum. It had been a testing ground, experimental treatments, procedures that blurred the line between science and cruelty, electroshock therapy without anesthesia, lobotomies performed with crude, imprecise tools, patients locked in isolation for weeks, forgotten in the dark. Many had died, and many of those deaths had never been explained. Bodies found with no official cause of death. Patients who had been recorded as alive one day and gone the next, their names erased from the logs. The deeper I dug, the clearer it became. Ironwood had been a place of suffering, and I had moved into its remains. Then, I found her. Buried. In an old file, hidden beneath a stack of faded documents, was a name. Eleanor Vale. A patient admitted in 1903, labeled hysterical, placed under solitary care, died under unknown circumstances. No record of a burial, no surviving family. Just a name and a photograph. I stared at the grainy image, my breath catching in my throat. Her face was blurred, damaged by time. But the gown, the white gown, torn at the edges. I had seen her before, in my loft, standing at my bedroom door, watching me. I slammed the file shut, my pulse hammering. This wasn't just history. This wasn't just an old story. Eleanor was still here. And for some reason, she had chosen me. I didn't know why. I didn't know what she wanted. But I knew one thing for certain. Ironwood wasn't just haunted. It was waiting. And something inside it had finally decided that it was time to be remembered. I stopped feeling like myself. The more I learned about Ironwood, the worse it got. It wasn't just the history pressing in on me. It was the building itself. I felt it in my bones. The exhaustion was the first sign. It clung to me like a second skin, a weight I couldn't shake. No matter how much sleep I got, I woke up drained, sluggish, like something had siphoned the energy from my body overnight. Then came the headaches. Sharp, splitting pain behind my eyes, the kind that made the light unbearable. And the worst part? I wasn't the only one. One afternoon, I ran into my neighbor, Ben, in the hallway. He was an older man, had lived in Ironwood longer than anyone else, always kept to himself but friendly enough when we crossed paths. That day, he looked like hell. His skin was pale, almost gray, dark circles sunken under his eyes. He walked slowly, as if moving hurt. "You all right?" I asked, shifting my bag higher on my shoulder. Ben let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "No one's all right in this place." I frowned. "What do you mean?" His eyes flicked to the ceiling, then back to me. "You ever notice how quiet it is at night?" I hesitated. "Yeah." He nodded. "That's not right. A building this old, with this many people, it shouldn't be silent. It should breathe." I didn't know what to say. Then, before I could stop him, Ben leaned in, lowering his voice. "Ironwood doesn't let people go," he murmured. "It feeds." A chill crawled down my spine. Then, just as quickly as he had appeared, Ben turned and shuffled back into his apartment, locking the door behind him. That night I started hearing it again, the whispers. At first I thought it was coming from outside, carried in by the wind. But the wind doesn't whisper your name. I sat up in bed, my breath shallow, the room too cold for a summer night. The sound was inside the walls. Soft at first, distant, then growing louder, the syllables twisting together into something I almost but not quite understood. Then, the smell hit me, antiseptic, sharp, cloying, mixed with something deeper, rot. I gagged, covering my mouth. The room spun, a wave, of nausea hitting me so fast I barely made it to the bathroom. I gripped the sink, my stomach twisting violently. Then I glanced up at the mirror and saw her, Eleanor, standing in the doorway, her gown clinging to her body like wet fabric, her eyes black pits in her gaunt, hollowed face. I turned, my heart slamming against my ribs. She was gone. The apartment was empty, but the scent lingered. And the walls? The whispers never stopped. I called my mother the next morning. I hadn't spoken to her in weeks, too caught up in my research, too consumed by the weight of Ironwood. She picked up on the third ring. "Sweetheart?" Her voice was warm, familiar, safe. "Everything okay?" I wanted to lie, but the words slipped out before I could stop them. "Mom, do you remember when I was little, when I used to wake up at night scared?" A pause, then softer. "You mean the night terrors?" I swallowed. "Yeah. You used to say there was someone in your room," she said gently. "A woman standing by your bed. You'd wake up screaming." I felt my stomach drop. I had forgotten. Or maybe I had forced myself to forget. "Do you remember what I used to tell you?" she asked. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to breathe. "You told me it wasn't real." Another pause. Then quietly, "No. I told you she couldn't take you if you didn't listen to her." My skin went cold. She sighed. "Sweetheart, I think you need to leave that place." I gripped the phone tighter. "I can't." Because Ironwood wouldn't let me. Not anymore. Not now that it knew I was listening. I started looking deeper. If Eleanor had died in Ironwood, there had to be a record. A place where she had spent her final days, but no matter how hard I searched, I couldn't find anything. No room number, no cause of death, like she had never existed at all. I was losing time. I'd wake up hours later than I remembered falling asleep. Things in my apartment would be moved, just slightly. Papers shuffled, books left open on pages I didn't remember reading. And the worst part? I wasn't alone anymore. The shadows weren't just at the edges of my vision. They were closer, watching, waiting. The next time I saw Ben, he was sitting on the steps outside, staring at the ground, his hands shaking. "I found her room," he said before I even spoke. My breath caught in my throat. "Where?" Ben lifted his head, his eyes bloodshot. "You don't find it," he whispered. "It finds you." That night I dreamed of a door I had never seen before. It was set into the brick wall of the basement, a rusted iron plate bolted across it. Faded, barely visible letters were carved into the metal. Ward 6. I woke up, gasping, my pulse hammering. Ward 6 didn't exist, at least not on the official blueprints, but I knew. I had to find it, because whatever was inside that room had never left, and now it was calling me. I didn't go looking for Ward 6. It found me. I had planned to leave. That morning, I packed a bag, shoved my laptop and research notes inside, and told myself I was done. Ironwood had sunk its teeth into me, but I wouldn't let it drag me under. Then the power went out. The apartment was plunged into absolute darkness. Not the normal kind. Something deeper. The air turned thick, wet, like I was breathing in something. Rotten. The scent of antiseptic and decay filled my nose. Then, the whispers. Not inside the walls anymore. Inside my head. I gritted my teeth, shoving my bag over my shoulder. I wasn't staying, I was getting out. But when I reached for the doorknob, my stomach dropped. It wasn't my door. The wood was different, darker. The handle was old, rusted, not the modern brass fixture I had used every day since moving in. This wasn't my apartment anymore. I turned slowly. I was in a hallway. Not the bright, renovated corridors of the lofts. This was something else. The air was damp, thick with mold. The walls were lined with rusted metal doors, each one bolted, shut, peeling paint curling at the edges. The kind of doors used in asylums. At the far end of the hall, I saw it. Ward 6. My breath hitched. It was just like in my dream. An iron plate bolted across the door, the words etched into the rusted surface. This wasn't a dream. This wasn't real. I was awake. The whispers grew louder, rising. A chorus of voices begging, pleading, screaming. I wanted to turn, to run, but something pulled me forward. I stepped toward the door. One step, then another. And then, a hand slammed against the window. I stumbled back, my pulse hammering in my throat. The glass was smeared, old, nearly opaque, but I could see her, Eleanor. She wasn't a mist anymore. She was real. Her face was pale, gaunt, her eyes two sunken pits of blackness. Her lips moved, whispering something I couldn't hear. I should have run. I should have never come here. But I was frozen, trapped in her stare. Then, from behind the door, the screaming started. It was inhuman. Not one voice. Hundreds. Layered on top of each other, rising, filling the air with something that was more than sound, something that pressed into my skin, my bones, my skull. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. It was inside, me. I turned, my vision spinning, my breath ragged. I had to get out, now. I stumbled back, reaching for the door behind me. My door, the real door, the one that would take me home. But there was no door anymore, just the dark, just the voices, just her. Eleanor lifted her hand again, pressing her palm against the glass. And suddenly, I understood. They had never let her leave. She had died in this place, trapped behind that door, her body buried somewhere in the asylum's walls. The doctors had erased her, wiped her name from the records, but she was still here. And she had brought me to this place because she wanted me to see, to remember. Then the voices stopped. The air shifted, and I was falling. Not physically, it felt like something had reached inside me and pulled me backward. I hit the floor hard, the cold wood of my apartment, my real apartment. I gasped, my body trembling, my head spinning. The whispers were gone. The rot, the screams, the darkness, gone. I was back. I don't know how long I lay there. But when I finally forced myself to stand, my hands still shaking, I knew one thing. I was leaving. For good. I never went back. I never told the landlord why I broke my lease. I didn't explain why I left all my furniture behind, why I never looked back as I drove away from Hollow Creek. I didn't need to, because I knew the truth. Ironwood wasn't just haunted, it was hungry. It had taken so many people before, me. But Eleanor saved me. I don't know why. Maybe because I listened. Maybe because I remembered her. Maybe because she didn't want to be alone anymore. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispers. Faint. Distant. Not inside my walls, but inside my head. And I wondered, did I really escape, or did Ironwood just let me go? I used to think horror movies exaggerated things. You know the ones, where the protagonist ignores every instinct, makes all the wrong decisions, and ends up somewhere they were never supposed to be. I used to roll my eyes at those scenes, but after what happened to me in the fall of 2017, I don't laugh at them anymore. Because now I know that sometimes you don't realize you're in a horror story until it's too late. I was 19 when I got a job at Eddie's Pizza, a family-owned shop in the Ozarks. It was the kind of small-town place where the biggest excitement was a new item on the menu, where Friday night rushes were fueled by high school football games. Most nights were the same. Deliver a few orders, collect some tips, go home. Simple. Until one night it wasn't. It was a slow Tuesday, almost closing time. I was already thinking about heading home when the last order came in. The ticket printed and something about it felt wrong. The address wasn't one I recognized. It was way out of town, deep in the woods. We didn't normally deliver that far. I frowned, reading the details. Customer, M. Abbott address, Route 16, mile marker 12. Instructions, leave it on the porch. No knocking, no talking. Weird. I glanced at my manager, Tony, who was counting the register. Hey, we don't deliver past Route 10, right? He didn't look up. Not usually. Why? Got an order way out on mile marker 12. That got his attention. He set the cash down, giving me a look. 12? I nodded. Tony's expression darkened. He wiped his hands on his apron, sighing. You sure it's not a mistake? I held up the ticket. Came through 5 minutes ago. He hesitated. Then quietly he said, You can turn it down. That sent a chill through me. Tony wasn't the superstitious type. He was a big guy, a former Marine, the kind of person who didn't get rattled easily. But now he looked uneasy. I swallowed. I mean, it's just a delivery, right? Tony rubbed his jaw. Used to get orders from that road every now and then. Always weird ones. No names, just initials. Cash only. I stopped sending drivers after one of them came back freaked out. I frowned. What happened? He shook his head. Wouldn't say. Just quit the next day. I forced a laugh, trying to ignore the creeping dread in my stomach. It's probably some hermit who doesn't like talking to people. Tony didn't laugh. He just looked at me for a long time, then said, Take the company car, don't use yours. 15 minutes later, I was on the road. The drive was long, the lights of town fading behind me until it was just me, the car, and the empty stretch of highway cutting through the Ozark woods. There were no houses out this way. No streetlights, just trees. Dense. Endless. The further I drove, the more isolated it felt. Like I was the last person left in the world. I checked the GPS. No signal. Figures. Mile marker 10. The road narrowed. The trees pressed in closer, branches forming twisted shapes against the night sky. The headlights barely cut through the darkness. Mile marker 11. I should have turned around. Something in my gut screamed at me to turn around, but I didn't, because I told myself I was just being paranoid, that this was just another delivery. I kept driving. Mile marker 12. I slowed down, scanning the trees. Then I saw it. A mailbox, barely visible in the darkness, its paint peeling, the numbers 12 carved into the wood. A narrow dirt path led into the forest, disappearing into the trees. This was it. I pulled in slowly, gravel crunching beneath the tires. The deeper I went, the worse the air felt. Thick, heavy, like the woods were pressing in around me. The smell of damp leaves filled my nose. Then the cabin came into view. It was old, not like a cozy log cabin. This place looked wrong. The wood was dark, warped by time and rot. The windows were covered, the porch sagging. There were no lights on, no signs of life, just the pizza delivery instructions telling me to leave it and go. I parked, leaving the engine running. The second I stepped out, the air turned dead silent. Not a single insect, not a single sound. The kind of quiet that makes your instincts go haywire. I hurried to the porch, placed the pizza box on the worn wooden boards, and turned to leave. Then I heard it. A click, like a door unlocking. I froze. Slowly, I turned my head. The cabin's door was cracked open, a sliver of pitch-black darkness staring back at me. And then, a whisper, not words, just a sound. Soft, low, coming from inside. I bolted. I sprinted to the car, threw myself inside, and slammed the door shut. The headlights cast long shadows across the porch. The pizza box was still there. The door was still open. Something moved inside. I didn't wait. I threw the car in reverse, tires spinning as I backed out of that driveway so fast the gravel kicked up behind me. I didn't breathe until I was back on the highway. I made it back to Eddie's Pizza in record time. Tony took one look at me and nodded. "You saw it, didn't you?" I swallowed hard. "I don't know what I saw." Tony sighed, rubbing his face. "Yeah, that's what the other guy said." I stared at him. Then, after a long pause, I asked, "Who keeps ordering from there?" Tony's expression darkened. "That's the thing," he muttered. "Every time we check the number, it doesn't exist." A shiver ran down my spine. That night I didn't sleep, because somewhere out in those woods someone or something had been waiting for me, and I had almost knocked on the door. I didn't go back to work the next day, or the day after that. I told Tony I wasn't feeling well, which wasn't a lie. My body was fine, but my mind, my nerves were still shot. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that cabin, the open door, that black void inside, and the whisper. It played on a loop in my head, a sound I still couldn't describe. It hadn't been words, not exactly, but it had meaning, like something seeing me for the first time, like something that had been waiting. After a few days, I convinced myself it had been my imagination. Sleep deprivation, paranoia, too many horror movies messing with my head. The place was creepy, sure, but that didn't mean something unnatural had been out there. At least that's what I tried to believe. And I might have convinced myself, if the calls hadn't started. It was a Thursday night when the first one came. I was lying on my bed, scrolling mindlessly on my phone, trying to not think about the cabin when my screen lit up. Unknown number. I frowned. Normally I ignored stuff like that, but something about this felt different. I answered. At first there was nothing, just static. Then, a click, like a door unlocking. The air in my room turned ice cold. I sat up, my pulse hammering, gripping the phone so tight my fingers ached. "Hello?" No answer. Just breathing. Shallow, slow, listening. I hung up. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to every creak, every gust of wind outside my window, convinced I wasn't alone. The next morning, I went straight to Eddie's Pizza. I needed answers. Tony was in the back when I walked in. He took one look at me and sighed. You look like hell. I sat down across from him, rubbing a hand over my face. I need to know more about that place. Tony didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he stood, grabbed a chair, and sat down heavily. You're not the first one to come back, shaken, he muttered. I leaned forward. Who else? Tony exhaled. A guy named Caleb. Worked here before you. Same deal. Late night delivery, strange address, middle of nowhere. Came back pale as a ghost. Quit the next morning. I swallowed. Did he say what he saw? Tony shook his head. Wouldn't talk about it, just left town. The words settled over me like a heavy weight. I glanced toward the front counter where the order ticket's printed. That number, the one that keeps calling in the orders. You ever check it? Tony nodded slowly. It doesn't exist. A chill crawled up my spine. You sure? Yeah, he said. Every time I've tried to call it back, I get that message. Number not in service, but somehow the orders still come through. I didn't know what to say, because that didn't make sense. Tony sighed, rubbing his jaw. Look, man, if I were you, I'd forget about it. You got out. Just let it go. I nodded, but the truth was, I couldn't. Because the whisper hadn't left me. Because someone had called me last night. And deep down, I knew. This wasn't over. Not even close. I tried to let it go. I really did. For a few days, I ignored the tight feeling in my chest, the nagging itch in the back of my mind that told me something wasn't right. I didn't answer unknown numbers. I kept my blinds shut at night. I stopped, looking over my shoulder every time I walked outside. I pretended things were normal, but they weren't. And deep down, I think I knew they never would be again. The calls didn't stop. They came at random hours, always from an unknown number. Always the same pattern: silence, breathing, the soft click of a door unlocking. It didn't matter if I answered or ignored it. The result was the same: the whisper. It was never loud, never clear, but I could hear it just enough. A sound that curled under my skin, just beyond understanding. Not words, but intent. And every time, it felt closer, like something was getting used to me, like something was learning. Then, things got worse. The first time I noticed it, I had just finished a shift at Eddie's. It was late, past 11, and I was walking to my car when I got the feeling that I wasn't alone. At first, I brushed it off. The mind plays tricks in the dark. But as I slid into the driver's seat, something made me stop. A shape, in the tree line, too far to make out, but there, standing perfectly still, watching. I stared at it, my hands tightening on the wheel, heart hammering in my chest. But the longer I looked, the more uncertain I became. Was it a person, a tree, a shadow? Then, as if it knew I was watching, it tilted its head. I drove home so fast I barely remembered the ride. But the worst part? When I pulled into my driveway, I sat in my car for a long time, staring out into the trees that lined my backyard. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure if I was alone anymore. And I didn't want to find out. By the next day, I was unraveling. I was running on maybe 2 hours of sleep, my nerves shot. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow felt too long. The air felt different, like something heavy was sitting in my chest, pressing down. Tony noticed. "Kid, you good?" he asked as I clocked in. I forced a laugh. "Yeah, just tired." He didn't buy it, but he didn't push. "Take the night off if you need it." I almost said yes. Almost. Then, the printer at the counter buzzed, spitting out an order ticket, and the second I saw the address, my stomach dropped. Customer M. Abbott, address Route 16, mile marker 12. Instructions: leave it on the porch, no knocking, no talking, the exact same order, the exact same place. I turned to Tony, heart pounding. Did you block this number?" His face paled. "I tried," he said, "but it keeps coming through." The ticket sat between us, ink still fresh, The words staring back like a dare, like an invitation. I don't know what made me do it. I should have torn it up, should have let someone else take it, or better yet, just ignored it altogether. But I didn't. Instead, I grabbed my keys, and against every ounce of common sense, I said, "I'll take it." Tony's expression darkened. "Kid, I just want to see something." I didn't explain, didn't tell him about the calls, the whispers, the thing in the woods, because I had to know. I had to see it for myself. Even if I already knew, I wouldn't like the answer. The drive back to Route 16 felt different this time. Last time I was nervous but dismissive. I told myself it was just another weird delivery, just some loner who didn't like small talk. But now I knew something was wrong. I didn't bother checking my phone. There was no point. I wouldn't have service. Just like last time. Just like it wanted. And I knew deep down that something was waiting for me. The road narrowed as I got closer to mile marker 12. The trees pressed in from both sides, swallowing the sky, the darkness stretching unnaturally long. The air felt heavier, thick with damp rot, and something else. Something that made my stomach twist. Then I saw the mailbox. The same weathered wood, the carved number 12, the barely visible path leading into the trees. I slowed to a stop. Everything in my body screamed at me to turn around, to put the car in reverse and never look back. Instead, I gripped the steering wheel, exhaled shakily, and pulled in. The path was rough, the gravel crunching beneath my tires. The headlights barely cut through the dark. I kept my eyes forward, refusing to look into the trees because I knew I would see something if I did. And then, just like before, the cabin appeared. It looked exactly the same. The warped wood, the covered windows, the sagging porch, but this time something was different. The door was already open, not cracked like before. Wide open, like it had been waiting for me, like it knew I was coming, back. I killed the engine but left the car running, headlights glaring against the rotting wood. The pizza box sat in the passenger seat, but I didn't move to grab it. I just sat there, staring, waiting. The cabin didn't move. The trees didn't sway. The night was dead silent, pressing in around me like something alive. Then, a sound from inside. Not the whisper. Not yet. Something shuffling. Something moving just beyond the doorway. I gripped the steering wheel, heart slamming against my ribs. Do not get out of the car. That's what my brain told me. But my body ignored it. My hand moved to the door handle. I pushed it open and stepped out. The air outside was wrong. Colder than it should have been. Thicker. It settled on my skin like damp wool, seeping into my bones. I took one step forward, then another. The gravel crunched beneath my boots, too loud in the crushing silence. I reached the hood of the car, stopping just short of the porch. From this close, the cabin looked worse. The wood was split. The nails rusted. The windows weren't just covered, they were scratched. Deep, jagged lines gouged into the glass, like something inside had been trying to get out. I swallowed hard. Then, a voice, low, raspy, coming from inside the cabin. "You came back." My entire body locked up. I knew that voice, not because I'd heard it before, but because I recognized it. It was mine. I took a step back. The whisper returned, soft, crawling over my skin, wrapping around my mind like tendrils of cold fog. But this time it wasn't coming from the cabin. It was coming from the trees. I turned my head, and I saw it, standing just beyond the tree line, half hidden in the shadows. Not human, not animal, something in between. It had limbs that were too long. A body that looked stretched, stitched together from things that didn't belong. Its skin was rough, mottled, shifting between fur and something slicker. But the worst part, its face. It wasn't a skull. Not quite. It had the shape of a face, but the features were wrong, unfinished, like it had been studying humans but hadn't figured out how to make itself right, and its eyes, black, hollow, looking straight at me. Then it moved. Not walking, not running, just there 1 second, gone the next. The whispering grew louder, and suddenly I wasn't alone. More shapes in the trees. More things. Watching, mimicking. The one closest to me opened its mouth, and I heard my own voice come out. You came back. I ran. I didn't think, didn't breathe, just ran. I barely hit the driver's seat before slamming the door shut. Throwing the car into reverse, gravel sprang as I tore backward down the path. I didn't look back, I couldn't, because I knew if I looked into the trees, I would see them, and I didn't want to know how many there were. The headlights bounced as I skidded onto the main road, tires screeching against the pavement. I floored it, hands shaking on the wheel. It wasn't until I saw the first streetlight that I let out a breath. Not relief, just realization. Because something had changed. I had seen it now, and it had seen me. I didn't just deliver to that place. I had been invited back, and I had answered. I don't remember getting home. I don't remember getting out of the car or locking my door or collapsing onto my bed. I just remember lying there, staring at my ceiling, heart still pounding, and then the phone rang. I knew who it was before I even looked. Unknown number. I didn't answer. I turned off my phone, but just as I was about to close my eyes, a whisper, right outside my window. Not words, not a voice. Just a mimicked sound, a door unlocking, and then a long, slow knock. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The knock had been too soft, too controlled. Not the way a person knocks on a door. It was slow, deliberate, practiced, like something was testing it out, like something was learning. I squeezed my eyes shut, every muscle in my body screaming at me to run, to move, to do something. But I couldn't, because for the first time in my life, I knew that if I moved, if I made a single sound, it would know I was awake. And I didn't want to know what happened after that. The seconds dragged, then another knock, this time closer. I forced myself to sit up, my breath coming in short, uneven bursts. My phone was still off, my room still dark except for the faint glow of the streetlight outside. For a split second, I considered turning on the lamp, but then I remembered something that wasn't human, didn't need light to see. I reached under my bed, my fingers closing around the baseball bat I kept there. My pulse thundered in my ears as I moved toward the window, slowly, carefully. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see, but I had to. I had to know if it was real. I pushed the blinds apart a fraction of an inch, and my stomach dropped. There was a figure standing at the edge of my yard, too far to see clearly, but close enough that I knew it was watching. It wasn't moving, just standing there, like it had been waiting for me to look. Then, in the dim light, something shifted. I sucked in a breath. Its head was tilting, just like before, just like in the woods. I dropped the blinds and stumbled, back, my chest rising and falling too fast. I told myself it was just my imagination, just paranoia. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. I had brought it back with me. The rest of the night passed in a haze. I didn't sleep. I sat on my bed, gripping the bat, staring at the door, waiting for the next knock. It never came, but that didn't mean it was gone. The last delivery. I quit my job at Eddie's the next day, didn't even give notice, just walked in, handed Tony my uniform and told him I couldn't do it anymore. He didn't ask why. He just nodded like he already knew. Like he had expected this. I stopped answering unknown numbers, blocked everyone that came through. But they kept calling. And the worst part? They weren't just at night anymore. They were during the day. While I was at the grocery store, while I was driving, while I was at home, doors locked, curtains drawn, and every time it was the same. Silence. Then the sound of a door unlocking. Then the whisper. 1 month later, I moved to a new apartment across town. Didn't tell anyone my new address. Didn't even take most of my stuff. Just packed a few bags, left everything else behind. I told myself I was safe now, that it didn't know where I was, that it had given up. And for a while I almost believed it. Until last night. It was late. I was lying in bed, half asleep, the hum of the city outside my window. Then, my phone buzzed. I reached for it, groggy, barely registering the screen. Unknown number, A. Cold dread curled in my stomach. I almost ignored it. Almost. But something in me, some deep, horrible instinct told me to answer. So I did. I pressed the phone to my ear, heart hammering. And this time, there was no silence, no breathing, no whisper, just my own voice, flat, emotionless. You came back. The line went dead. I stared at my phone, my blood like ice. My own voice. It had learned, and it had found me. I sat there for a long time, gripping my phone, staring at the screen. Then, from outside my apartment, a knock. Slow, deliberate, practiced. Closer this time. Hungrier, waiting. And I knew, no matter how far I ran, no matter where I went, it would always find me. The summer Liam came to stay with us, something about him had changed. He had always been quiet, the kind of person who preferred listening over talking, but this time, he seemed different, withdrawn, distracted. His already pale skin looked even more washed out, and the dark circles under his eyes made it clear he hadn't been sleeping well. At first, I didn't think much of it. We were both 17, maybe he was just going through something. A breakup? Family trouble? I figured if he wanted to talk, he would. One evening, we sat on the porch, the thick summer air buzzing with cicadas. Liam had been unusually silent all day, barely touching his dinner. Now he sat beside me, staring out at the darkened yard, twirling an empty soda can between his fingers. Finally, he broke the silence. "There's something at my house," he said. His tone was so flat, so matter-of-fact, that for a second I wasn't sure I'd heard him right. I turned to him. "What do you mean?" Liam let out a slow breath, his fingers tightening around the can. "I don't know, it's just always there, watching." The way he said it made my skin crawl. I forced a nervous laugh. "Watching? Like, you think someone's been breaking in?" He shook his head. "No, it's not a person, it's something else." I didn't know what to say. I believed in God, in good and evil, but I wasn't the type to jump to ghosts or demons. Still, the look on Liam's face, it wasn't the expression of someone playing a joke. It was fear. He rubbed his arms like he was cold despite the heat. "I hear things, whispers, but I can never make out what they're saying. And the shadows." He trailed off, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed. "They move when I'm not looking, like they're shifting just out of sight." A strange chill ran through me. "Have you told your parents?" I asked. They wouldn't believe me. I hesitated, then placed a hand on his shoulder. "I'll pray for you," I said. "For your house, too." Liam let out a humorless chuckle, shaking his head. "Yeah? You think that'll help?" I frowned. "Of course." He didn't say anything after that, just sat there, staring into the dark. 3 days later, he went home. That's when it started. At first, it was small things, easy to ignore. The day after Liam left, I felt uneasy. The house seemed different, quieter in a way that didn't make sense. But I told myself it was just the empty space where Liam had been. Then came the nail. I was on the phone with my mom, pacing the hallway, when I noticed it. An old nail, halfway up the wall. It had been there for years, hammered in deep. But as I stood there, I saw it move. It wiggled. Just slightly. I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me. But then, slowly, the nail began to slide out. A cold wave of unease swept over me. "Mom, I'll call you back," I said, hanging up. I stepped closer and pressed the nail back in with my thumb. It stayed for a moment. Then just as slowly, it began to work itself out again. My chest tightened. I yanked it from the wall and threw it across the room, shaking off the chill that had settled over me. It's nothing. Just the house settling. That night, I had my first episode of sleep paralysis. I woke up, or thought I did. My room was the same, the familiar glow of the streetlight filtering through the blinds. But I couldn't move. I couldn't even blink. Then I saw it. A shadow stood in the corner. At first it was just a vague shape, a trick of the light. But the longer I stared, the clearer it became. Tall, unnaturally thin, its head tilted slightly, like it was watching me. I tried to scream, but my throat was locked. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. The figure moved. I don't remember breaking free. 1 second I was frozen in terror. The next I was gasping, sitting up in bed, drenched in sweat. I wanted to believe it had been a dream, but deep down, I knew better. The sleep paralysis continued, night after night, and each time, the figure appeared closer. I stopped sleeping in my room. Instead, I moved to the couch in the living room, hoping the change would help. It didn't. One night I woke to something worse, a whisper, right beside my ear. I jolted awake, my skin crawling, but there was no one there, just the soft hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of a car passing outside. Then I heard it, again, a breathy, indistinct whisper, coming from the hallway. I lay frozen, straining to make out the words, but they were too low, too muffled. A strange cold settled over me, the kind that didn't come from the AC. Then the shadow moved. It stretched across the floor, long and shifting, even though there was nothing there to cast it. I grabbed my blanket and fled to my mom's room, too scared to explain why. A week later it escalated. I woke up to growling. At first I thought it was my dog, but then I realized she was standing over me. Her fur bristled, staring at the doorway. The front door was wide open, and in the darkness beyond, something stood there, watching. A hooded figure, its face hidden. The dog let out a low, warning growl. The figure didn't move. Then, from somewhere unseen, a soft voice whispered, "Don't touch her." The figure jerked like something had yanked it back. Then it vanished. I scrambled up, slammed the door shut, locked it, and sat there shaking. I barely slept after that. Over time, the worst of it faded. The whispers stopped. The paralysis became less frequent. But the presence never really left. Some nights I still feel it, watching. The air will turn cold for no reason, my body tensing like something is near. Liam doesn't talk about it, I don't either. But sometimes when I call him, there's a hesitation in his voice, like he knows, like he still feels it too. And I wonder, did I get rid of it? Or is it just waiting for me to let my guard down? Cedarwood Cottage had always been home, though it felt different now. After years of traveling for gigs and playing in dimly lit bars, I had moved back in with my sister Vivian and her 6-year-old son Finn. It was supposed to be temporary, a way to save money while I figured out my next move. But from the first night I felt off. The house had a way of breathing at night. Floorboards creaked when no one was walking. A faint draft whispered through the hallway, even though all the windows were shut. And then there was the music. The first time I heard it, I had just come home from a late gig. Vivian was asleep, Finn tucked safely in his room. I was exhausted, but as I stepped inside, I heard it. A soft, discordant melody drifting from the music room. I froze, listening. It wasn't a full song, just scattered notes like someone lightly pressing keys on my piano. The air in the room felt heavy, charged, as if the walls were holding their breath. I told myself it was nothing. The wind, the house settling, maybe even my imagination. But as I walked past the music room, I saw something that made my stomach drop. The piano lid was open. I never left it open. I shut it quickly, ignoring the prickle of unease creeping up my spine. The house had been empty all night. There was no one here but me. Still, as I climbed the stairs to my room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something unseen had been watching. A week passed, and the strange occurrences continued. Most were small, lights flickering, the occasional cold draft, the piano, keys shifting ever so slightly as if someone had just played them. It was easy to explain away, until Finn started talking about the man in the hallway. Vivian and I were in the kitchen when he first mentioned it. He was sitting at the table, lazily drawing with his crayons, when he suddenly said, "Aunt Clara, do you know the tall man?" I looked up from my coffee. "What tall man?" "The one who stands in the hallway at night," Finn said, like it was the most normal thing in the world. "He watches you when you come home?" My blood ran cold. Vivian stiffened beside me. "Finn, sweetie, there's no man in the hallway." "Yes, there is," he insisted. "He's really tall and dark. He doesn't have a face." A thick silence settled over the room. I forced a smile. "It's probably just a shadow, buddy." Finn just shrugged and went back to his drawing. But my hands were shaking as I gripped my coffee mug. Because deep down I knew. Finn wasn't imagining things. The sleep paralysis started soon after. I had never experienced it before. But the first time it happened, I woke up in the middle of the night to the sensation of something pressing down on my chest. I tried to move, but my body was frozen. Then, I felt it. Something cold traced patterns across my arm. Slow, deliberate, like icy fingers skating across my skin. I couldn't breathe, couldn't scream. I tried to focus on the shadows in the room, but they were moving. One in particular, a tall, stretched figure in the corner, stood unnaturally still. I felt its presence like a weight in the air, oppressive and suffocating. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the pressure lifted. I gasped, bolting upright, my body slick with sweat. The room was empty, but the feeling lingered, like something had been there only moments before. The next morning I tried to tell myself it had been a dream. Stress, fatigue. But the bruises on my arm, faint, finger-shaped marks, told a different story. The haunting escalated. The music became louder, no longer just faint, scattered notes. It was deliberate now, as if someone was practicing. I would be in the kitchen and hear my violin let out a single, drawn-out note from the music room, even though no one had touched it. The metallic scent started appearing too. Subtle at first, then stronger, like rusted iron seeping through the air. And then, there were the shadows. I had been avoiding the hallway at night, but one evening I made the mistake of looking into the mirror by the stairs as I passed. I saw him. A figure stood at the end of the hall, impossibly tall, his form a void of darkness, his limbs stretched too long. I turned, heart pounding. Nothing was there. I didn't sleep that night. I knew I couldn't live like this anymore. Vivian had noticed my exhaustion, the way I jumped at every sound, the fact that I never played music at home anymore. But I couldn't tell her the truth. Instead, I did something desperate. That night, before going to bed, I left the piano lid open, and I waited. At exactly 3:13 a.m., the first notes rang out, slow, off-key, like fingers testing the keys. I held my breath. The air in the room turned freezing. Then, from the darkness, a whisper, faint, raspy. "Play." I shot up, flipping on the light. The room was empty, but the piano lid had slammed shut. That was the final straw. The next day, I found an old priest who had helped my grandmother before she passed. I told him everything, and he listened with grim understanding. "This house holds something old," he said. "It does not like to be ignored." He blessed Cedarwood Cottage, walking through each room, reciting prayers in a language I didn't understand. He left markings above the doors, small symbols drawn in chalk. That night, for the first time in months, the house was silent. No music, no whispers. The air felt lighter, as if something had finally let go. But I still don't play music at night, and I still don't look too long into the hallway mirror. because I know even if the house is quiet, it's still watching. I never used to believe in omens. To me, ravens were just birds, symbols of folklore and superstition maybe, but nothing more. I was a rational person, someone who trusted in logic, in explanations. Even when I was a child and my grandmother used to warn me about the messengers of the beyond, I dismissed her stories as just that, stories. But that was before I moved into the loft. The Blackwood Lofts had once been a textile factory, built in the late 1800s and later abandoned after a fire gutted most of the upper floors. A few years ago, developers turned it into upscale apartments, modern and sleek, with exposed brick, walls and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city skyline. It was the kind of place I had always wanted. Industrial but refined, full of history yet undeniably modern. When I first toured the unit, something about it felt off. Not in an obvious way, nothing I could put my finger on, but just beneath the surface, like a note played out of key in an otherwise perfect melody. Maybe it was the silence. Even in the middle of the city, the loft was almost unnaturally quiet. The usual sounds of traffic, the distant murmur of voices from the street below, none of it seemed to reach inside. It was like the air itself absorbed the noise. Still, I ignored the unease that crept up my spine. It was probably just my nerves. A big move, a new chapter. I told myself it was just me. I signed the lease that same afternoon. The first few weeks in the loft were uneventful. If anything, I was relieved. After years of cramped apartments with paper-thin walls, I finally had space to breathe. The ceilings were high, the windows wide. At night, the city lights flickered against the glass, and I fell asleep to their soft glow. But then, I started seeing the raven. It wasn't unusual to see birds in the city, but this one was different. It was massive, larger than any raven I had ever seen, its wingspan impossibly wide, its feathers dark and glossy like polished obsidian. It always perched in the same spot just outside my window on the rusted fire escape. At first I barely noticed it, but then I realized it was always there. Morning or night, whenever I glanced outside, I would see it. And more unsettling than its presence was the way it watched me. Its eyes weren't the dull black of an ordinary bird's. They were too deep, too intelligent. They followed me as I moved through the apartment, unblinking, too still. I tried to shoo it away, banging on the window. It never flinched. One night, as I was brushing my teeth, I caught a glimpse of it in the reflection of my bathroom mirror. It was still outside, its dark shape framed by the city lights. And for the briefest moment, I could have sworn I saw something else. A shadow, long and stretched, standing just behind it. I spun around. There was nothing there. I turned back to the mirror, my pulse hammering in my throat. The raven was gone. That was the first night I dreamed of the dark figure. At first the dreams were vague, just flashes of movement, glimpses of something watching from the shadows. But each night, they became clearer. I was always in the loft, but it felt wrong. The walls stretched too high, the shadows too deep. And in the corner of the room stood a figure. It was tall, its body shifting like smoke, its limbs elongated, unnatural. I could never see its face. Only the outline of something humanoid, its form flickering at the edges like an image struggling to stay in focus. And always in the dream I felt it watching. Not with eyes, but with something deeper, something that saw through me. I would wake up gasping, drenched in sweat, my breath coming in shallow bursts. Each time the loft felt colder, as if something had passed through while I slept. I told myself it was stress. My job had been demanding, and the move had been a big change. It was natural to have strange dreams, but deep down I knew this wasn't just a dream. Something was in the loft with me, and the raven knew. The final sign came 3 weeks after I moved in. I had been working late, trying to distract myself from the growing unease that followed me through the apartment. Around midnight, I finally closed my laptop and turned toward the window. The raven was there. Only this time it wasn't alone. Perched beside it, barely visible in the dim city light, was another figure. a shadow shaped like a man. It stood just behind the bird, its form darker than the night itself. Its head tilted, slightly as if studying me through the glass. My breath stalled in my throat. I blinked. It was gone, but the raven remained, watching, waiting. I didn't sleep that night, and for the first time I truly understood what my grandmother had meant. The raven had come as a messenger, but what it had brought with it was something else entirely. I was never one to scare easily. Growing up, I had spent countless nights alone, wandering unfamiliar streets in new cities, staying in old buildings with histories of their own. But something about the loft, about the raven, about the thing I'd seen in my dream, had lodged itself deep in my chest. It wasn't fear in the way I had known it before. This was something else. A slow, creeping unease. A presence just out of reach. At first, I tried to ignore it. I buried myself in work, kept music playing at all times, filled the silence with anything I could. But the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it grew. The air in the loft felt heavier, like it was pressing down on me. My shoulders ached constantly, a dull, persistent weight that never quite lifted. I convinced myself I was imagining it, that the stress of moving and the lack of proper sleep were catching up with me. But then, the nights got worse. The first time it happened, I thought I was dreaming. I woke up to find myself unable to move, my body rigid and frozen against the mattress. My breath came in shallow gasps, my chest tight as if something unseen was pressing down on me. The room was dark, but not in the usual way. This was thick darkness, like the air itself had been drained of light. And then, I heard it. A croaking sound. Deep, guttural, like something forcing out breath through broken vocal cords. The raven. It was inside. I couldn't see it, but I felt it. The presence loomed over me, shifting in the darkness, just beyond my line of sight. My ears rang, with that awful sound, harsh, broken, wrong. I tried to scream, but my throat was locked, my limbs wouldn't move. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, so loud it drowned out everything else. Then the shadows moved. I saw it. Not clearly, not fully, but enough. A form, barely human, shifting and writhing as if it struggled to hold its shape. Its limbs stretched too long, its head tilted unnaturally. It hovered at the edge of my vision, flickering in and out of focus like a dying flame. The croaking grew louder. And then, whispers. Not words, not in any language I understood. But I felt them like vibrations in my skull, drilling into the space behind my eyes. It was speaking to me. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The weight lifted. The air thinned. I shot up in bed, gasping, my lungs burning for air. The loft was silent again, empty except for the sound of my own ragged breathing. I turned my head toward the window. The raven was perched on the fire escape, staring in. I swore it was smiling. The next morning, I left the loft without looking. I didn't care where I went, I just needed to be around people. I spent the day in coffee shops, wandering bookstores, anything to avoid going home. But I knew I couldn't stay away forever. By the time the sun set, I had convinced myself it had been a dream. A night terror, just like the ones I had read about. Sleep paralysis was common, wasn't it? The mind playing tricks in that fragile state between waking and sleeping. I almost believed it. Until I got home. The loft felt different. The air was thick again, charged with something unseen. The moment I stepped inside, the back of my neck prickled, my instincts screaming that I was not alone. I forced myself to walk in, to turn on the lights, to pretend that nothing was wrong. But every shadow in the room felt too deep, like something could be lurking just beneath the surface. Then I noticed it. The mirror in my hallway. A handprint. Smudged, blackened, too large to be my own. It wasn't just a dream. It had been real. And whatever it was, whatever had come into my room last night, it was still here. I didn't touch the mirror. I stood there staring at the smeared black handprint, my pulse hammering in my ears. My brain fought for a logical explanation. Maybe I had brushed against it with something dirty. Maybe the glass was just dusty and my fingers had left a mark, but the shape was too distinct. The fingers were too long. The imprint was too high, on the glass like something much taller than me had pressed its hand there. And worse, I had cleaned that mirror the day before. A heavy weight settled in my chest, something instinctive, primal. I wasn't supposed to be here. Something didn't want me here, but I had nowhere else to go. I forced myself to move, to act normal. I wiped the mirror clean with a rag, pretending I hadn't seen anything. I turned on every light in the loft, blasted music from my speakers, kept my hands busy making tea I had no intention of drinking. Anything to make it feel like I was in control. But I wasn't. Because even with all the lights on, the shadows felt too deep. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, afraid to close my eyes. Every time I started to drift off, I imagined it. That thing from the night before, standing over me, watching. Around 3 a.m. I heard it. At first, it was just a faint noise, barely perceptible over the hum of the city outside, but then it grew louder, unmistakable. The sound of something dragging across the floor. I stopped breathing. The noise was slow, deliberate, like someone pulling something heavy across the wooden boards. It came from the living room. I didn't move. My body screamed at me to stay still, to pretend I was asleep. Every muscle in me tensed, waiting. Then, a croaking sound. Low, guttural, broken. I clenched my jaw, swallowing down a whimper. The dragging noise stopped. And then, footsteps. Soft, measured. Coming down the hallway. Coming toward my room. I squeezed my eyes shut, my hands gripping the sheets. My chest felt tight, like I was suffocating under an invisible weight. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. Silence. Then, something scratched against the wood. Once, twice. A long, slow drag of fingernails, or something like fingernails, scraping against the doorframe. I couldn't move. The handle rattled. Just a little. Not like someone was trying to open it. More like they were testing it, seeing if it was locked. I didn't dare look. Then, silence. Minutes passed. Maybe hours. I don't remember falling asleep, but the next thing I knew, sunlight was pouring in through the window. I sat up, my entire body aching from how tense I had been all night. My throat was dry, my skin cold with sweat. I swallowed hard, staring at the bedroom door. It was open. Just a crack. I spent the next day in a fog. I couldn't focus on work, couldn't sit still. My hands trembled every time I tried to type. By sunset, I had made a decision. I wasn't staying here tonight. I packed a bag, just the essentials. I'd get a hotel, clear my head, figure out what to do next. But as I was zipping up my suitcase, the lights flickered. Then a sound. Tap, tap, tap. I turned toward the window. The raven was there, perched on the fire escape, its head tilted. Watching. It tapped its beak against the glass again. 3 times. Like a warning. A chill ran through me. I backed away, from the window grabbing my bag. But as I reached the front door, I froze. Something felt wrong. The air had changed. It was heavier now, colder. A pressure filled the room, thick and suffocating, pressing against my skin. Then, a whisper. Right behind me. Not words, just breath. Slow. Cold. Waiting. I didn't turn around. I threw open the door, stepped into the hallway, and slammed it shut behind me. I didn't stop moving until I was out of the building, out on the street, surrounded by people. Only then did I breathe. I wasn't going back. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. I checked into a hotel on the other side of the city, a place with bright fluorescent hallways and too many security cameras. I told myself I would feel safer there, but I didn't. Not really. Even as I swiped the key card and stepped into the room, a deep unease settled in my chest. The walls were too thin, the air too still. The hum of the heater did nothing to mask the silence pressing in around me. I kept telling myself that leaving the loft was the right choice, that whatever had been in there, whatever I had felt breathing against my neck, watching me from the shadows, it couldn't follow me. It was bound to that place, wasn't it? But as I sat on the bed staring at my reflection in the black TV screen, I realized something unsettling. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't sure if I was alone. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard things. Faint sounds at first, a creak in the hallway, a door softly shutting in another room. Normal hotel noises. But then, around 2 a.m., the noises changed. It started with the sound of rustling fabric like someone shifting just outside the door. Then came the tapping. 3 sharp, deliberate knocks. I held my breath, my body frozen in place. I hadn't ordered room service. No one knew I was here. I sat there, heart hammering, waiting for whoever it was to leave. Then, the doorknob rattled. Not aggressively, not like someone was trying to break in. It was worse than that. It was slow. Testing. I reached for my phone with shaking hands, my fingers barely able to press the buttons. I dialed the front desk. The receptionist picked up on the second ring. Front desk. "There's someone outside my room," I whispered. "They just tried the handle." A pause. Then, "What room number?" I told her. Another pause. Then, in a voice just a little too careful, "Are you sure?" I sat up, gripping the phone tighter. "Yes, I'm sure. I heard it." Silence. Then she cleared her throat. "We don't have any guests on that floor. You're the only one." Checked in. A cold, suffocating dread filled my chest. I hung up without another word. The air in the room felt thicker now, heavy with something unseen. I knew then, with absolute certainty, it had followed me. I didn't sleep after that. I sat in the chair by the window, watching the door, waiting for something, anything, to happen, but nothing did. Still, the feeling remained. By morning, I had made up my mind I couldn't run from this. Whatever had attached itself to me wasn't tied to the loft. It was tied to me, and I had to find a way to stop it. I spent the next day in the library, poring over old books and newspaper archives, searching for anything about the Blackwood lofts, about the building's history. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. The lofts had been built on top of something older, a building that had burned down in 1912. The fire had started on the top floors, trapping workers inside. Few escaped. Among the dead was a man named Elias Crow, a maintenance worker, lived alone, described as strange by his neighbors, and the final note in the article sent an icy shudder through me. Witnesses claimed to have seen large black birds circling the building in the weeks leading up to the fire. Ravens, they said, watching. I closed the book, my pulse pounding in my ears. The raven, the thing in my room, Elias Crow. I didn't know what any of it meant yet. But I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. Not even close. By the time I left the library, the sky had turned a deep, bruised shade of gray. The weight of what I had read pressed against my chest, a slow suffocation that no deep breath could fix. Elias Crow, a name that had been lost to time, buried under layers of history and tragedy. And yet somehow, it had clawed its way back, attaching itself to me like a parasite. I needed answers. I needed to know why. Instead of going back to the hotel, I found myself standing in front of the Blackwood lofts. The building loomed over me, its brick exterior darkened with age, the fire escape twisting like an iron spine along the side. It was strange. From the outside, it looked the same as always. But I knew better now. I wasn't just stepping into a renovated apartment complex. I was stepping onto a grave, a place where something had never left. I hesitated at the door, my fingers gripping the cold metal handle. Everything in me screamed, "Turn back." But I had run for long enough. I stepped inside. The silence was worse than I remembered. Not the normal kind of silence. This was weighted, thick, like the air itself was holding its breath. My footsteps barely made a sound against the hardwood floors as I walked toward my unit. The hallway lights flickered, the dim yellow glow stretching shadows in unnatural ways. By the time I reached my door, my hands were shaking. I slid the key into the lock. The moment I turned it, the temperature dropped. A bitter, stinging cold that crawled over my skin, seeping through my clothes, making it hard to breathe. I pushed the door open. The loft was not empty. I felt it the second I stepped inside, a presence waiting. The lights flickered violently, buzzing like they were struggling to stay alive. The air was thick, electric, filled with something unseen but undeniably there. And then, the raven, perched in the center of the room, its dark feathers glossy under the sickly light. It tilted its head, watching me, its black eyes reflecting something deeper than intelligence. Something hungry. Then the croaking started. Low, guttural. But it wasn't just coming from the bird, it was coming from the shadows. I turned slowly, and there, at the far end of the room, near the window, it stood. The figure. It was no longer flickering at the edges of my vision, no longer lurking just beyond sight. It was here. It stood taller than before, its form more defined. A man, but not quite. Its limbs were stretched too long, its head cocked unnaturally to one side. The shadows clung to it like living things, shifting, writhing around its body. And then, for the first time, it spoke. Not in words, not in any language I knew, but I felt it. A deep, vibrating sound that rattled in my skull, sinking into my bones. A voice that wasn't heard. It was absorbed. And somehow, in that horrible, soundless way, I understood what it was saying. It was saying my name, not as a greeting, as a claim. The cold deepened, pressing against me from all sides. My breath came in ragged gasps, my vision blurring at the edges. I tried to move, tried to scream, but I was frozen. Just like before. Just like it wanted. The raven let out another broken croak, and in the dim light I saw something I shouldn't have been able to see. The bird's shadow. It stretched too far across the floor, warping, twisting, connecting to the figure. And in that moment, I knew. The raven was not just a messenger. It was a piece of whatever this was. It had been watching, waiting, leading me back here. The figure took a step forward. The air rippled around it like heat waves distorting the world. My head pounded, the pressure unbearable, a deafening ringing in my ears. It reached out, long, dark fingers stretching toward me. And then, I screamed. The sound shattered the stillness. The lights exploded, plunging the loft into darkness. The figure recoiled, its form splintering, breaking apart like smoke caught in the wind. The raven shrieked, its wings flaring, the sound almost human in its agony. And then, silence. The weight lifted. The air thinned. I collapsed onto the floor, gasping, my body shaking so violently I could barely keep myself upright. The loft was empty. The shadows had receded. The raven was gone. I didn't stay the night. I didn't pack. I walked out of the Blackwood lofts and never looked back. In the months that followed, I tried to pretend it never happened. That it was just stress, exhaustion, hallucinations brought on by lack of sleep. But deep down, I knew better. Because sometimes, in the dead of night, I still wake up gasping for air. And somewhere, just outside my window, I hear the croaking. I moved to a new apartment across the city, one with bright lights and no history. I left everything behind, furniture, clothes, even my phone number. I wanted a fresh start, a place untouched by whatever had latched onto me. For a while it worked. The new apartment felt safe, normal, but the silence never truly left me. At night I kept the TV on, the hum of voices filling the empty spaces. I slept with the curtains drawn, refusing to look out the window. But no matter how much I tried to pretend, the feeling never completely went away. Then one night, it happened. Again. I woke up to the heavy, suffocating weight of something unseen pressing against my chest. My body was frozen. My limbs refused to move. The air in the room rippled, charged with something wrong. And then, tap, 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 from outside. From the window, I didn't want to look. I knew what I would see. But my eyes moved on their own, and there it was. A raven, perched on the ledge, its black eyes gleaming in the pale light. It tilted its head, watching. And behind it, a shadow. Not fully formed. Not yet. But waiting. I tried to scream, but my breath locked in my throat. Then, just as before, the shadow whispered my name, not as a greeting, as a reminder. I had never left it behind because it had never left me. I never used to be afraid of the woods. Growing up in Washington State, I had spent my childhood hiking through towering pines, camping beneath endless stars, and listening to the gentle rustling of wind through the trees. The forest had always been a place of peace for me, a sanctuary away from the noise and demands of everyday life. But that changed after what happened in the summer of 2018. That was the last time I ever went camping. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway. Just a few close friends, a cooler full of beer, and nothing but miles of untouched wilderness. The plan was simple. 2 nights at an isolated campsite deep in the Olympic National Forest, a place we had picked precisely because it was so far off the beaten path. It was me, my best friend Ethan, his girlfriend Mia, her brother Jason, and my childhood friend Ryan. 5 of us, plus Ryan's dog, Cooper, a scrappy golden retriever mix that had been coming on our trips for years. We packed light, just the essentials. A couple of tents, sleeping bags, enough food for the weekend, and a few flashlights. No cell service, no distractions, just us in the woods. At first, everything was perfect. The drive up was long, the roads getting narrower and more uneven, as we climbed higher into the mountains. Eventually, we had to ditch the car and hike the last 2 miles to our site, the trail barely visible through the thick underbrush. By the time we arrived, the sun was beginning to set, casting long golden shadows across the forest floor. It was breathtaking. The clearing was tucked between ancient fir trees, with a small creek running just beyond our tents. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. It was the kind of place that made you feel small, reminded you that the world was bigger than your problems. We set up camp quickly, unpacking our gear and gathering firewood. Ryan let Cooper off his leash and the dog darted happily through the trees, tail wagging. He always loved these trips. By the time night fell, we had a roaring fire going. We drank, laughed, and told stories under the stars, the warmth of the flames, keeping the night's chill at bay. It felt like any other camping trip. But then things started to feel off. The first sign was the smell. It drifted in on the breeze, faint at first, then stronger. A sour, rotting stench, like something that had been left out in the sun too. Oh, Jesus, Jason muttered, wrinkling his nose. You smell that? Mia gagged. What the hell is that? Ethan stood, sniffing the air. Probably something dead nearby, maybe a deer. That made sense. We were deep in the woods. Animals died all the time. But as the wind shifted, the smell lingered, thick and unnatural, like it was coming from all around us. Cooper, who had been lying by the fire, suddenly lifted his head, ears perked. His body tensed, muscles coiled. Then he growled, low, deep, a sound I had never heard him make before. The hair on my arm stood up. What's wrong, buddy? Ryan asked, reaching down to pet him. Cooper didn't react. His eyes were locked, on the darkness beyond the trees, his growl growing louder. The rest of us followed his gaze, but there was nothing there. Just the forest. Silent. Still. Too still. The usual sounds of the woods, crickets, rustling leaves, distant hoots of an owl had disappeared. It was quiet. Unnaturally quiet. I swallowed hard. We should turn in, I said, forcing a smile. Long hike tomorrow. The others nodded, eager for an excuse to break the tension. But as we put out the fire and zipped into our tents, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. And Cooper? He didn't stop growling for the rest of the night. The next morning, Ryan's dog was gone, and so was the feeling that we were alone in the woods. I woke up to the sound of Jason swearing outside my tent. The sun had barely begun to rise, casting weak rays of light through the trees. But the tension in the air was already thick, heavier than it had been the night before. The moment I unzipped my tent, I saw why. Ryan was standing near the dying remains of the fire, his face pale and tight. His hands were balled into fists at his sides. Cooper was gone. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe he had wandered, off, following some scent deeper into the woods. He was a smart dog, always found his way back. But Ryan wasn't convinced. "He never goes far," he said, shaking his head. "And he always comes back to the tent before sunrise." Ethan yawned as he stepped out of his tent, rubbing his face. "Maybe he's just sniffing around. We'll find him." But even he didn't sound sure. The unease from the night before hadn't left us. If anything, it had gotten worse. The forest felt different that morning. Too quiet. No birds, no insects. Just the faint rustling of leaves, like something was moving out there, just beyond our line of sight. Watching. Mia wrapped her arms around herself, rubbing at her shoulders. "I don't like this." Ryan ignored her and grabbed his flashlight. "I'm going to look for him." "I'll go with you," I offered, grabbing my boots. Ethan and Jason exchanged glances. "We'll check the other side of camp," Jason said. Mia hesitated, then muttered, "I'll stay here in case he comes back." And so we split up. Ryan and I followed the trail leading deeper into the trees, calling Cooper's name. The deeper we went, the colder it got. Not just from the morning air. This was different. A creeping kind of cold, the kind that sank into your skin no matter how many layers you had on. Ryan's voice was tense. "You feel that?" I nodded. "Yeah." We pushed forward, scanning the forest for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. No paw prints, no broken twigs, nothing that indicated a dog had passed through here. Then we smelled it. The same rotting stench from last night. Thick, putrid, clinging to the air like something had died nearby. Ryan gagged, covering his mouth. "Oh, God!" Then, something cracked in the distance. A branch snapping. We both froze. The sound hadn't come from the underbrush. It had come from above us. Slowly, we lifted our heads. And then, I swear, to God we saw something. A shape in the trees. It was high up, almost too high for anything to be sitting in those branches. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, just the shadow shifting in the early morning haze. But then it moved. A slow, jerking movement, like something shifting its weight. Ryan grabbed my arm. "We need to go." I didn't argue. We turned and sprinted back toward camp, our breath coming in ragged gasps. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might explode. When we finally broke through the trees and stumbled back into camp, Jason and Ethan were already there, their faces just as pale as ours. They had found something. Near the edge of the clearing, just past where the tents were set up, there were footprints. Not human, not animal. Something in between. The prints were deep, sunk into the damp soil, long and narrow with clawed toes. They didn't belong to any creature I knew, and worse. They led straight into camp, and then disappeared, like whatever had made them had just vanished. Mia was pale, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "Did you guys? We saw something," Ryan cut in, his voice hoarse. "In the trees." Jason cursed under his breath. "Yeah, us too." I swallowed hard. "It wasn't just a shadow, was it?" Jason shook his head. "No." None of us spoke for a long time. Then Ethan cleared his throat. "We need to leave." It wasn't a suggestion, it was a fact, because whatever was out there, it wasn't just watching us. It had been here, and it had taken Cooper. We were packing up within minutes. No one spoke much. There wasn't anything left to say. The plan was simple. Get the hell out of there. Ryan was the only one who hesitated. He kept looking toward the trees, scanning for any sign of Cooper. His hands were shaking as he shoved his gear into his backpack. He wouldn't just run off, he muttered under his breath, almost to himself. "Ryan," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We have to go." He didn't respond, just zipped his bag shut and threw it over his shoulders. None of us were willing to admit it yet, but we all felt the same thing. Cooper wasn't coming back. The problem with being 2 miles into the forest with no cell service is that once something feels wrong, there's no quick escape. We had to hike out. 2 miles. It felt impossibly far. Jason led the way, gripping his flashlight even though the sun was rising. Mia stuck close to Ethan, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Ryan was at the back, still scanning the woods. I kept my eyes ahead, focused on the trail, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. And then we heard it. A sound from deep within the trees. A whistle. Long. Slow. Mimicking. It was almost identical to the way Ryan used to call for Cooper. A chill ran through my entire body. Ryan stopped walking. His breathing was ragged, his eyes locked onto the trees. Did you hear that? No one answered, because we all had. And then, another whistle. Closer. Jason cursed under his breath. What the hell is that? I didn't answer. I couldn't, because something was moving out there. Not just the wind, not just the creaking of branches. Something was walking. I gripped my flashlight tighter. My hands were slick with sweat. My heart beat so loud in my ears that it almost drowned out the silence. Almost. Because then we heard footsteps. Heavy. Slow. Deliberate. Circling us. Run, Ethan whispered. No one hesitated. We bolted. The trail wasn't well worn. Roots and rocks jutted from the dirt. Branches clawed at our arms as we ran. My lungs burned, my legs screaming in protest, but I didn't stop. None of us did. Because something was behind us. I didn't dare look back. Ryan did, and the sound that came out of him, it was almost a sob. Go, 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 he screamed. I didn't want to know what he saw. I didn't want to see it. But out of the corner of my eye, I caught movement. Something tall. Something wrong. A blurred shape between the trees, moving in a way that didn't make sense. It was fast, but its movements were jerky, unnatural, like it wasn't used to running, like it was imitating what running was supposed to look like. We ran faster. Branches whipped against my face. My foot caught on something and I stumbled, barely catching myself. Ethan grabbed my arm, yanking me forward. Don't stop! The whistling started again, louder, closer, right behind us. The trail sloped downward. I nearly lost my footing as the ground turned to loose gravel. The parking lot was ahead. Our car still parked exactly where we had left it. We were almost there, almost safe. Then Ryan did the one thing he shouldn't have done. He stopped. Cooper! His voice cracked as he turned back toward the trees, eyes wide, frantic. I followed his gaze and, for a split second, I saw something standing at the edge of the tree line. Not fully in the light, not fully human. It was watching us, not moving, just standing there, too tall, too thin. The worst part? It looked like it was smiling. Not with a mouth. I never saw a mouth. But with its eyes. Empty black pits, locked onto Ryan like it had been waiting for him to stop. And then, it tilted its head. Get in the car, Jason roared. Mia was already fumbling with the keys, unlocking the doors. Ethan grabbed Ryan, yanking him backward as he gasped for air. We threw ourselves into the car. Jason gunned the engine, tires kicking up dirt as we sped down the winding road, away from the campsite, away from the thing standing at the edge of the woods. None of us spoke. The only sound was Ryan's breathing, ragged and uneven. His hands, shaking violently in his lap. His eyes were still locked on the trees. Even though we were miles away, even though the road was empty, because something was still out there, watching, waiting. And we had barely made it out alive. No one spoke for the first 10 minutes. The only sounds were the tires against the gravel road and the heavy breathing filling the car. Ryan was shaking. I could see it in the way his hands gripped his knees, his fingers twitching, his chest rising and falling too fast. Mia sat stiff in the front seat, her face pale, her eyes locked on the road ahead. Jason, gripping the wheel so tight his knuckles turned white, drove too fast down the winding dirt road. None of us cared. None of us wanted to be out here a second longer than we had to be. We had left the tent, the supplies, everything back at the campsite. It didn't matter. We just had to get out. But even as the car sped away, I couldn't shake the feeling. We weren't leaving it behind. Ryan was the first to break the silence. "What the hell was that?" His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper, but no one answered him. I could still see it. That thing standing at the tree line just outside of the morning light. The way it tilted its head, like it was studying us, like it had enjoyed watching us run. I swallowed hard. "You saw it too, right?" Jason let out a bitter, humorless laugh. "Yeah, we saw it." Mia shuddered. "I don't even know what I saw." I knew what she meant. It hadn't looked like an animal, not even a little, but it hadn't looked fully human either. Something about its shape was wrong. The limbs were too long, its movements too jerky, like it didn't fully understand how to control its own body, like it was pretending. Ryan finally lifted his head. "Cooper." His voice cracked. He was still out there. Ethan, sitting beside me, exhaled slowly. "Ryan, man, that wasn't Cooper." Ryan turned to face him, his expression desperate, almost pleading. "You heard him." His voice wavered. "You all heard him. That whistle, it sounded just like mine. He was out there calling for me." Mia shuddered, rubbing at her arms. "No, Ryan. Something else was calling for you." No one argued, because deep down we all knew she was right. The road stretched ahead of us, empty and endless, winding through the thick Washington forest. I checked my phone. Still no signal. We had to get closer to town. "Should we tell someone?" Jason asked. "Tell them what?" Ethan muttered. That something was out there mimicking Ryan's voice, that it was watching us? We don't even know what it was. Jason clenched his jaw. What if it's not just us? What if other people have seen it? That thought made my stomach turn. What if we weren't the first? What if we weren't the last? I glanced back out the window, half expecting to see something running alongside the car, a dark shape darting between the trees. The image was so vivid in my mind that for a second, I was convinced I had seen something move. I tore my gaze away. We needed to get out of this forest. We must have been driving for an hour before Jason finally cursed. "What the hell? What?" Mia turned toward him, tense. Jason's grip tightened on the wheel. "I don't recognize this road." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "There's only one way back." He shook his head. "No, I mean, we should have hit the highway by now." The words sank in like a rock dropping into my stomach. I checked my phone again. Still no service. Mia pulled up the map on hers. No signal. No GPS. Ryan exhaled shakily. "We're not lost. We can't be lost. We didn't take any turns." Jason pressed down on the gas, frustration creeping into his voice. "Then why the hell are we still in the woods?" No one had an answer, because he was right. We should have been back on paved roads by now. The way out wasn't that long. It didn't make sense, unless... My throat went dry. Unless it didn't want us to leave. Mia's breathing hitched. "Guys." Her voice was so quiet I almost didn't hear it. But when I looked up, the road was different, not just unfamiliar, wrong. The trees looked closer than before. Their trunks were thick, twisted, like they had grown too fast, too unnatural. The branches stretched overhead, forming a canopy that blocked out the sky. And the worst part? The road ahead curved back into the forest. "We should have been out of here by now," Ethan murmured. No one spoke after that. We just kept driving, and the farther we went, the darker the woods became. Then the smell came back. The same rotting stench from last night. Thick, putrid, soaking into the car. Mia gagged, covering her nose. "Oh my God." Jason rolled down his window, but it didn't help. The air outside was thick with it, and then we heard it. The sound we had all been dreading, whistling, long, slow, right outside the car. I barely had time to react before something slammed into the hood. Jason slammed on the brakes. The car skidded, tires screeching as we jerked forward. For a second, everything was silent. Then, a low tapping on the windshield. Tap, tap, tap. I forced myself to look up, and there it was, standing in the middle of the road. It was closer now. I could see the way its body twitched, shifting awkwardly, not quite human. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, its arms too long, its fingers curled like claws. But its eyes were the worst part. Black, hollow, staring directly at Ryan. It opened its mouth, and I swear to God, I heard Cooper's bark. Ryan let out a choked noise, something between a sob and a gasp. Then Jason slammed his foot on the gas. The thing didn't move. Not at first. It just watched, us standing perfectly still as the car lunged forward. Then, just as we reached it, it vanished. Gone. Like it had never been there at all. No one spoke. No one breathed. Jason didn't stop driving. He didn't slow down. He just kept going. Hands gripping the wheel so tight I thought he might snap it in half. And then, the trees thinned, the road straightened, and we were out. Back on the highway, back in the real world. The air felt different. Lighter. Like something had finally let us go. But none of us felt safe. Because we all knew it was still out there. And it had been hunting us the whole time. No one spoke for the first few miles. Jason kept driving, white-knuckled, his foot pressed hard on the gas. The rest of us sat in silence, our eyes locked on the road ahead. It was as if we all shared the same fear, that if we looked back, we might see it standing there, waiting, grinning from the edge of the woods. Mia had her knees pulled to her chest, arms wrapped tightly around herself. Ethan sat stiffly, staring out the window, his jaw clenched so hard I thought his teeth might crack. Ryan was the worst. He hadn't moved since we got on the highway. He just sat there, breathing shallowly, staring at the dashboard like he wasn't really here anymore. And I understood why. We had all heard it, that bark. It had sounded exactly like Cooper, but it wasn't him. Something had learned his voice, learned how to mimic it perfectly. And if it could do that, what else could it do? 30 minutes passed before Jason finally spoke. I don't think we should talk about this. His voice was quiet but firm. Ethan exhaled sharply. You think pretending it didn't happen is going to make it go away? Jason's hands tightened on the wheel. No, I think saying too much about it is going to make it come back. The words sent a chill down my spine. I didn't know if he was right, but I wasn't willing to test it. Mia swallowed hard. So what do we do? Just pretend? Jason didn't answer. Because there wasn't an answer. None of us knew what to do. We made it back to civilization just after noon. The moment we got cell service, everyone's phones blew up with notifications. Missed calls, texts, voicemails from people who hadn't heard from us in 2 days. It was a small, normal thing, but it felt wrong. Like we had stepped back into a world that had kept moving without us. Like we weren't supposed to be here. We stopped at a gas station on the outskirts of town. The second Jason put the car in park, Ryan got out. He didn't say a word, just stumbled away from the vehicle. Like he was going to be sick, I followed him. Ryan. He stopped near the side of the building, gripping the brick wall, his shoulders heaving. He wasn't crying, but he looked like he wanted to. I stood beside him, unsure of what to say. Then, after a long pause, I should have gone after him. His voice was raw. I shook my head. No. If you had... I know. He cut me off, his voice tight. I know. But it doesn't make it better. I didn't say anything. Because he was right. Nothing about this was better. The drive back to our separate homes was quiet. When we finally pulled up to Ryan's apartment, he hesitated. You guys want to come in? It was such a simple question, But none of us wanted to be alone. We sat in his living room for hours, just existing in the same space. No one talked about the woods. No one talked about what we saw. The silence stretched on, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was almost like we were waiting, like we expected something to follow us back. But it didn't. The sun set. The world kept turning. And eventually, one by one, we all went home. I tried to sleep that night. I really did. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw it again. Standing in the trees. Watching us run. Mimicking. Learning. I tossed and turned, feeling like I was being watched even though my bedroom door was locked. And then, somewhere in the distance, I heard whistling. It was faint. Could have been the wind. Could have been nothing. But I knew better. Because it was the same tune Ryan used to call Cooper. The same one we had heard in the woods. I didn't sleep that night. And the next morning, I threw away all my camping gear. I never went into the woods again. We never talked about it, not really. Every now and then one of us would check in, just a simple text. Hey, you okay? We all knew what it really meant. Have you seen it again? The answer was always the same. No. But I could tell we were lying. Because some nights when the wind is still, when the trees sway just right, I swear I can hear it. That long, slow whistle, calling me back, waiting, hungry.